suppose I should ask if anybody has any questions from any of the prior classes.
What prior
Where'd we leave off?
I don't know.
Start all over again. We're getting into general ethics, I think.
Yeah, we're probably, I was going to say at the bottom of page 2.
Ethics is not mores.
Your numbering is different than mine, so
This is a.
Under page 12.
Focus upon the subject man seems like.
Yes,
where we should be beginning.
that's where I am. Yeah, I'm not really sure. Not really sure I want to start there, but
Okay.
that's where we are. You have to bear in mind, this is a course in, I was going to say general ethics, but it isn't, because we'll do both general and special ethics, but it is an introductory level course. Ethics is unbelievably complicated, and it's far easier to lay down the general principles than it is to apply them in concrete situations. And some of the cases that we can run in today are doozies by any standard. I think of the one that just a couple months ago I was dialoguing with at least one philosopher and one theologian about, and that was the question of whether it would be licit for a condom to be used in a marriage where one person had HIV and the other was totally sterile, or both of them, or either one was completely sterile, and it was scientifically established. This led to an interesting dialogue in which there was heated discussion from a couple angles. The theologian and I were of the opinion that it was not licit. The philosopher was arguing that it was. I think of another case a few years back when the President Bush determined that we could licitly use stem cells, embryonic stem cells that were derived from, or stem cells that were derived from an embryonic strain, wherein, of course, the immorality of terminating the embryos had already taken place, and we still had the leftover embryonic cells that we could work with, and the question was whether that was licit. And the initial reaction was, again, even among the Catholic philosophical and theological community, was some were saying, no, you can't, and some, such as Janet Smith, were saying, yes, you could. And at one point, finally, the Bishops' Conference issued a statement. I shouldn't even say the Bishops' Conference. I think it was a decision of an individual archbishop that it was not licit. Now, you might ask, well, if that's the kind of controversies we can have, then how can you have a general science that gives us universal principles? Well, that's the whole point. They are principles. These are extraordinary cases. Stop and think about them for a moment. How often are you going to run into this? The embryonic strains were once over and done, no more available. In the case of findings, one person with HIV and the other being, or one or both of them being totally sterile, it would also be relatively rare. What you have to understand is that the general principles can be very clearly distinguished and laid down. Indeed, most of the standard cases that you would run into are well established and well thought out and well determined. But what happens, particularly in bioethics, is new developments, new technology pose problems, often at the fringe. Very relatively rare cases where people say, gee, I hadn't thought of that before, and therefore you have to, again, focus in on it. And what happens, as I dare say happened in those two cases, is that qualified experts in the various fields chewed out the various analyses and the various conclusions and finally did come to a resolution in both cases. And in both cases, the answer was in the negative. But initially, this was not sufficiently evident to everybody. You have to not only bring into focus the principles from natural law ethics, but as in the case of the HIV condom use with sterility, you have to also integrate it with the theological aspect of the fact that you're dealing with a sacrament of marriage, matrimony. That adds another dimension that has to be taken into account. So the fact that you may hear about some of these controversies taking place every now and then about very difficult issues should not lead one to underestimate the value of the general science of ethics. The general science of ethics, when you're dealing with questions, general questions like capital punishment, abortion, sterilization, euthanasia, the principles have already long ago been worked out and applied, and we will be looking at them as we proceed through the material. And those types of issues really ought not be controversial except to those who do not understand ethics, of whom there are a great deal, of course. So let us go back and focus again more specifically on the subject that we were developing. Here we're talking about ethics as focusing upon the subject, which is man himself. And we consider what elements would be brought to bear in order to determine the morality of acts. And of course, since we're talking about man, we have to understand what is a human being. If you don't know what a man is, you're not going to be able to determine what's good or bad in terms of his behavior. We are specifically studying human conduct, and conduct which is human, that is, that which distinguishes us from lower animals and, of course, plants. What we want to know in ethics is specifically what must man do in order to be happy, in order to attain happiness. And of course, many people disagree as to what will make them happy. And if we are to reach a scientific conclusion, we ought to be able to reach a defensible conclusion that is applicable to every human being in virtue of being a human being. The elements we have to look at entail, I'm being a little slavish to my notes tonight, you see we're not wandering all over the place like we were in the previous classes. One thing we have to look at is the affective life, that is to say, in terms of the animal elements of our nature, the sentient elements, that we are involved in seeking sensible goods. But then, of course, the question is, if we are seeking sensible goods, how does it differ? How do the rules of conduct differ for us and for animals? And of course, you undoubtedly immediately realize that animals don't have rules of conduct, at least not the way we do. Whatever they do, they do. Nobody blames them. If a dog bites a postman, we might get mad at the dog, but we don't say, "You abominable beast, how could you have done this to me?" You might say more than that, but you don't ultimately hold the animal responsible because it doesn't have free will. So the affective life, the behavior that we have in reference to our sense experience is always going to be conditioned by the fact that we're human. And being human means that we bring to bear intellect and will in what we call the human act, which is point 2 there. The human act, of course, is what specifically makes us different from any mere animal. Human act is measured by the fact that it requires human faculties to produce it. It's human because it is something different than what you find in the vegetative kingdom or the animal kingdom. And what makes us different is that we have intellect and we have will. And there really isn't a question of conduct in reference to the intellect. Being stupid is not a sin. Drawing in a false conclusion, though, could be a sin. Because, as St. Thomas indicates, when you reach a false conclusion, it's because in some way you have leapt over the evidence wrongly. Leapt in the sense of your will pushing you to a conclusion, because the evidence certainly didn't lead to it. Somehow you leaped to a conclusion you ought not have reached. So there is an element of fault there. To some extent, you're saying, well, I'll bet that's the answer. And all right, I'm not saying that it's a mortal sin or anything, but there is a recognition that there's some kind of a failing insofar as you have made an inference that the evidence does not warrant. And it could not warrant it if the intellect were being used properly. But when we talk about the human act, we're particularly talking about the act of the will. This is what differentiates us from the animal kingdom. It is the free act, the act for which we are responsible, the deliberate act. And we're going to have to take a close look at what is entailed in the free act. Is every act free? Are we able to have greater or lesser degrees of responsibility for our action? Again, this is one of those things that you all know the answers to already. You know them because you've had a lot of life experience. You know them because you directly intuit many of the answers. So what is different about what we're doing here? What we're doing here is going to be done in a scientific way. That is to say, we're going to try to be able to give an explanation of why the correct answer is correct and why no other answer would be acceptable. In other words, this is a science. And as a science, as Aristotle would say, a scientific conclusion is one in which we know the truth, we know why it is the truth, and we know why it cannot be other than the truth. That's how he defines the elements of the scientific syllogism. So, talking about freedom, because that's the essence of where we're going to find morality, we get into the question of the voluntary versus the involuntary. We are going to deal with points 3 and 4. You'll notice these kind of repeat themselves. Freedom of the will and the relationship of the means to the end. All of these elements come into play. When we talk about the human act, I'm under section 2+. Don't ask me how all these things get numbered. I'm notoriously bad at numbering my notes. My students would really be pulling their hair out because I had a system that was not a system, and they never could figure out where on earth I was. I did redo it when I made these out. It's somewhat better. You have no idea how bad it used to be. But anyway, we have a 2+ here, whatever that is. And it's the second point, but enhanced. Under the human act, we have 3 elements to consider. One of the things you'll see in ethics is there are endless distinctions. I don't want to say worse than metaphysics, but there are endless distinctions here. So you have divisions, and then you'll have different kinds of divisions, and then divisions within the divisions. With respect to the human act, you have 3 things that we're looking at: the end, the means, and the execution. When we talk about the end, we bring to bear the 2 faculties, the intellect and the will. And I say the 2 faculties, but you have to be a little bit careful. If you remember from philosophical psychology, how many intellects do you have?
2.
You have 2 intellects. That confuses the daylights out of people, because there is what we call the agent intellect and the patient or passive intellect. They play a diverse role in the formation of the universal concept. The agent intellect having the function of abstracting the universal form from the concrete image, which it then uses to impress the patient or passive intellect, putting it into the act of actually understanding the nature of the object which is apprehended. Now, what's that all about is simply this, that the actual act of understanding is done by the passive intellect. And that's what people usually mean when they say, I've got an intellect. What's your intellect? That's what you understand with. That's what you know with. The agent intellect is a faculty which Aristotle reasoned had to exist in order to explain the function of the passive intellect. But when you ask people, how many intellects do you have, they naturally will say, well, 1. Why? Because, well, that's what I understand with. Okay, so when we talk about intellect here, we're really talking about the passive intellect. So in case those of you who are aware of the distinction that I just brought up again, so you not be confused, understand we're talking here about what Aristotle and St. Thomas call the passive intellect. And as far as the end is concerned, we perceive it as a good. If there were not an end for our action, we wouldn't do anything. If you didn't, for example, sense that you were hungry and that stopping at this restaurant would enable you to get some food to satisfy that hunger, you wouldn't bother stopping at the restaurant, would you? There'd be no purpose in doing anything to attain the end because you wouldn't desire the end. You apprehend that this food, which you anticipate being at the restaurant, will be the good which will satisfy your hunger. Now, the good is being as desirable. So the intellect apprehends being, but it apprehends it as being something desirable. So the food as such, by the way, need not be desirable, because if you're not hungry, or if you're suffering from abdominal pain already, or you have nausea, that food is not going to attract you. It's only going to attract you when you are in such a condition that your bodily being responds to it as an appropriate object of desire. So the intellect apprehends some end as a good. Bear in mind, it could be a physical end, it could be a spiritual end. It could be the attainment of the beatific vision. It could be the acquisition of a hamburger. Those are both legitimate goods. Intellect apprehends. The will makes the act of intending to get to that end. So we say intention is of the end. The will act by which we move ourselves towards the end is called intention. This, as opposed to when you're dealing with the means, you got to stop your car, you got to get out of the car, you got to go into the restaurant, you've got to order the food that you want, you've got to pay for the food. Those are all means to get you to that end. So the intellect, again, understanding is required because we have to engage in a judgment as to how we're going to get to the end. And indeed, as I just indicated, multiple judgments. There's a lot involved usually in attaining a particular end. You have to do a lot of reasoning, you have to understand a lot of the means ordered to that end. We engage ourselves in all kinds of judgments. You notice that the terms counsel and deliberation are there. Actually, if you go through it in detail, I think there are 12 steps of the act of the intellect between selecting the means and attaining the end. And we're not going to go through them.
Dr. Waters did.
Well, God bless him.
Way back when. Yeah.
I confess he always could, and I always couldn't. But the thing that strikes me is when you're done with a course like this, you're never going to remember the 12 steps. But it is important to at least understand that there are multiple steps, considerations that we engage in, reflections, by which we evaluate the fittingness of a certain means to the end. We evaluate the ups and the downs of selecting a certain means, and maybe some other means would be better in some respects and not in others, and that's where we're deliberating about what kind of actions we should take in order to attain an end. And then the act of the will in reference to the means is called choice. I choose this means in order to get to that end which I intend to attain. So that generally speaking, we say intention of the end and choices of the means. We talk about freedom of choice. Bear in mind that you have freedom with respect to your ends as well, at least any end short of the ultimate end. So the will is coming to play in multiple ways. And then, of course, we have the execution of the particular act, even if it's just a matter of walking up to the counter and placing an order for the food. That's entails, again, the intellect understanding what we are doing and willing the acts, the operative acts of even our body to engage in paying for the food and picking it up and walking off and consuming it. So the complexity of human life becomes evident when we're talking about ethics. And that's why it is so blessedly difficult to understand, and why we are often in a quandary. You could know all that you find in that big red book, Man is Man, that some of you may have, and that originally accompanied this course. You could know everything that's in it, but then trying to actually choose how to live and what to do, that's quite another matter. And we have some astounding cases of people who apparently know everything there is to know about the theology, and yet they utterly seem to self-destruct in terms of their actual living. I'm not going to name names, but some of you know who I mean. Very public figure. This is astonishing. So the pity of it is you can know all there is about ethics and still be leading a wretched life. I dare say, I'm sure after a while your ethics probably wouldn't come across quite as well, but there's a difference between knowing what is right and doing what is right. I mean, it makes me think of my old pastor, Father Foley, up here at St. Bernard's many years ago. A similar distinction. He said it's a lot easier to do good than to be good. What great wisdom there is there. It's always easy to reach in your wallet and throw some money at somebody. But to do the right thing morally, that's difficult. It's easier to be good, to do good than to be good. And of course, you see many public figures who are enormously charitable. They're involved in every possible crusade there is, but their lives are a moral shambles. Okay, next point here. We talk about freedom of the will. We make the distinction between psychological and moral freedom. I confess, when I saw that term psychological, I always found that a little confusing because it sounded like you were doing psychology. And the distinction entailed here is when somebody says, I want to rob that bank, and you say, well, you can't rob that bank. You're not free to do it. And the person says, of course I am. I've got a gun, I've got a car, I'm going to walk in, I'm going to do it. I'm free to do it. What do you mean I'm not free? Well, what we mean, of course, is that he isn't morally free to do it. We have what is called here the psychological freedom. I can do it if I want to, but moral freedom means, is it a permissible act? Is it a morally correct act? Am I morally free to do it? And clearly, there are a lot of things that we're not morally free to do. And in terms of the act that is performed, notice again the distinction between the end of the agent and the end of the act. Because you might say, well, somebody's, as in the case of eating food, the end of the agent oftentimes is simply because they're hungry. They want to get rid of their hunger. Or the food tastes good. That's a good reason. That's the end of the act itself. I'm sorry, that's the end of the agent, because that's why the agent is doing it. But the end of the act is nutrition. Like it or not, that food is going to go in you and possibly wind up as fat cells. It's going to do it. Can't do a thing about it. So we always have to distinguish between why we are performing a certain act and what the act itself is. It may be something that we think is, like Robin Hood, robbing from the rich to give to the poor. Wonderful, what am I doing? I'm giving to the poor. But the question is, what am I doing? How am I doing this? Well, there's a little difficulty there. And of course, we'll go a lot further into that. So I almost would prefer if there was some other word we could use in psychological, but that's the term that's used. So psychological freedom just means what I can do if I want to do it. And nobody can stop me, as it were. But moral freedom has to do with, is the person free? That is, are they permitted to perform this act without incurring some kind of moral opprobrium? And then, of course, we have technological freedom. I don't know what that is because my notes don't tell me. But I suppose what it means is that technologically we're capable to do a lot of things that we couldn't do 100 years ago. So our freedom does expand, obviously, in that sense, and gets us into more trouble, doesn't it? Because we can do things now we couldn't do before and never thought of doing and couldn't have done, and thank heavens we couldn't have done them, and now we can. And it's terrible. Freedom of the will, two aspects to that: freedom of specification, freedom of execution. That is, I can choose, for example, somebody offers me a box of candy, I can choose to eat this candy or that candy. That's freedom of specification. And I could just say, no, I'm on a diet, I won't eat any. See, that's freedom of execution. I'm just not going to do it. I have the freedom either to act or not act, and if I do act, then I can specify what that act will be. Again, we're just laying down some of the broadest categories that one has to think about in terms of developing the science of ethics. Relationship of means to end. How does the means relate to the end? You see some interesting distinctions here. We have what are called proximate means. In other words, it's near, proxima, it's near, it's right on top of the end. So if you select a proximate means, you're just about to attain the end. I mean, I suppose if you've picked up the hamburger and you're about to sink your teeth into it, that's a proximate means to eating the hamburger. You're there. We have remote means. I suppose that would be just parking your car outside the restaurant. You're not really there yet. And of course, this is very relevant because, as you know, in terms of pastoral theology, we talk about remote occasions of sin, and we talk about proximate occasions of sin. And when you're dealing with a remote occasion of sin, of course, there's much greater latitude permitted because there are degrees of remoteness, and the proportionate reasons to be in that context can be lesser than they would be if you're dealing with a proximate occasion of sin. But of course, we're not talking about sin yet because we're doing ethics, and we'll have to work our way up to sin later on. I hope that's not misunderstood. And then, of course, we have the ultimate end. If you know the ultimate end, that ought to govern all intermediate, proximate, and remote ends. The ultimate end for man, as we've already seen, although we're going to probably hit it again, is the attainment of God. The ultimate happiness, the supreme good, and everything in life ought to be subordinated to and ordered to that ultimate end. Now, of course, sometimes people argue, well, as Plato did, if you really knew what the ultimate end is, and if you really knew the relationship of what you're going to choose to the ultimate end, you'd have no choice but to do what is right. And yet, of course, we call that the Socratic fallacy, because if there's anything we know, it is that we can know exactly what is right and do exactly what is wrong. Wretched state we human beings find ourselves since the fall. I don't mean last fall, I mean the fall. Original sin. So, why is it that we can choose what is wrong? The difficulty, plainly, is that the last end is not clearly seen in this life. Nobody already has a vision of God. If he does, we, in most cases, try to find a good psychiatrist for him. I'm not talking about the saints, of course. But we also, and much more importantly, do not have a clear apprehension of the relationship between this act and our last end. If nothing else, we can always convince ourselves, well, even though I do this horrible deed, surely I'm not going to die at the same time. I'll have time to fix things up, right? It doesn't always happen, but That's one of the last refuges that we reach for when doing something we know to be morally wrong. The universal experience of man, and we need not go into it further, is that we can know what is right and do what is wrong. So what's wrong with Socrates? What's wrong with Plato? Were they stupid? No, because what they were talking about, they presumed that you had an absolutely clear understanding of this act as this means to your end. They were presuming that a man could have such a clear vision of the relationship of the means to the end that there would be no way in which he would fail to do it. The problem, of course, that in practice and in the practical context of our lives, we do not have such a clear vision. So in a certain way, Socrates and Plato were right, and in another way, they were dead wrong. But I think they would have been the first to admit that in the practical order, most men are not capable of having this kind of certitude. Susan?
So you're saying that they were speaking prescriptively and not descriptively?
I don't know, what's the difference?
Like, this is the way that he should act had he this perfect understanding?
I think they were saying, they're not saying that this is the way he should act. They were saying this is the way he would act if you had a perfect understanding. You know, it's like if you walk into a bank to rob the bank, if you knew for sure that the moment you said this is a holdup, there would be a bank guard there who'd pull out a gun and shoot you dead, would you rob the bank?
No.
No, because you'd see clearly what's going to happen when you perform this illicit deed. That's what Socrates and Plato were saying. If you had that kind of clarity of vision about every act you were to perform, there would be no way that you would do anything except what is ethically right and what leads you to the last end, the attainment of the one, the good, the true, and the beautiful. See? That's what they're saying. The practical difficulty is we just don't have that kind of knowledge. And the bank robber, when he walks in, is hoping the guard isn't there. Sometimes he's dead wrong.
Or he's dead.
Okay, page 14, that's referring to Higgins. And anytime you see page numbers, it is referring to Higgins' Man as Man, The Science and Art of Ethics, that big, thick, red book that some people have and most people don't.
And it used to be green,
It used to be green?
the old version.
Oh, okay. The only ones I've seen were red. Right and wrong need a true end for human acts in order to be objectively measured. In other words, how are we supposed to know what is right or wrong? How are we supposed to have a measurement of what is a proper act or an improper act? And what this is saying is we need to have a true end. There has to be a true end for human acts. In fact, and we have to know what it is. And indeed, it has to be common to all men. If we're going to say that we have a universal science of ethics, we have to all be heading in the same direction. Now, of course, many people say, but that's absurd. People go in different directions. People seek different goods. Somebody says, you know, my good life is all the riches I can have. Others say it's all the sex I can have. Others say it's all the power I can have. But what this says is you can't have a common science of ethics if there isn't a common and knowable last end. Same for everybody. And here again we have to make a distinction between what we subjectively know and what is objectively true. There is a common last end because we have a common human nature. And as we saw in prior classes, that common last end is the ultimate good. Because we are satisfied by nothing less than the ultimate good. Once we understand the nature of the good, we immediately recognize the difference between a limited good and an unlimited good, because every good we experience in this world is a limited good. It doesn't satisfy us. We'll trump that up a little further, so I'll kind of curtail it for now. It doesn't satisfy us. The only thing that will satisfy us is a good that's good from every possible angle, because then there's no way to look at it and say, oh, but it's defective here. But the only thing that's good from every possible angle would be the infinite good, which is God. And that's why metaphysics is presupposed for the science of ethics. Ultimately, you would have no last end if you couldn't demonstrate the existence of the supreme good, which is God. So you cannot have ethics without metaphysics. You need the metaphysics to demonstrate that there is a last end, and one to which every human nature must be conformable. It is because we have a common human nature that there is a common last end to man. What is that common human nature? Rational animal. Going all the way back to Aristotle, we are rational animals. And what that means, fundamentally, from the philosopher's standpoint, as I recall Dr. Waters saying many times, you could have a creepy crawly thing coming across the floor with many, many legs. But if it turns out that it's able to play chess with you, if it turns out that it's got an intellectual mind, then that's a human being. Because it's rational and it's an animal. Now, do I expect a human being to look like that? No, I think not. I think you can make a case, believe it or not, I saw one not long ago, a case that there is some natural superiority to the human appearance. The fact that we are able to stand up above most other animals, not elephants, most dinosaurs, but most other animals. The fact that we have faces by which we are able to convey our meaning and our understanding and our sincerity and our hypocrisy. All these things are, it'd be hard to imagine a bird having that kind of capability. Their beaks don't bend very well. So we do have a common nature, and the rationality, the definition, rational animal, the rationality, of course, bespeaks the intellect. We are intellective animals. And wherever you have an intellective animal, wherever you have an intellect, you have this ability to understand the limited nature of finite goods, and therefore the desire, the need for the infinite good. So what I'm trying to say is, the common human nature is that we possess this intellective capability that orders us to God as our last end. That's what we all have in common. If you can find any other intellective beings running around, they've got the same thing. Now, of course, you might say, well, what about an angel? The angelic order, they don't have bodies. That will affect their ethics to a certain extent, because they don't have all the problems we have, because we do have bodies. Our ethics is, in a sense, perhaps more complex. But they too have the same last end of knowing and loving God as being the only thing that will ultimately satisfy them. So the natural end of man is perfect happiness, which is the perfect satisfaction of the rational appetite. Rational appetite is just another name for what? The will. The will. The rational appetite is the will. Nothing will satisfy the will except the attainment of God. St. Thomas, in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, chapters 1 to 63, begins with the chapters 1 through 5. He deals with the fact that every agent acts for an end. Every agent acts for good. And then he works his way up to explaining how this applies to man in our seeking of goods. And then he goes step by step showing all the things that don't give us happiness as our last end. He shows that it is not pleasure. I mentioned this before. Remember I was talking about putting the salt or the pepper on the hamburger. You remember that joke? Right. The seeking of pleasure is not something that gives us complete satisfaction, because the senses, of course, the older we get, the more they become dulled, and that which we would have sold our soul to the devil for when we were 20 eventually doesn't seem as attractive. So pleasure alone is not going to give us happiness. Besides, problem with pleasure, if you think about it, pleasure is a sensitive reward given by nature for the performance of an act which is good either for the individual or the species. What the heck does that mean? Well, when you eat, you desire the pleasure of the food, but the end of the food is nutrition, which is good for you as an individual. The hamburger doesn't care whether you enjoy it or not, it's still going to give you nutrition. And the same thing with sex. Sexual pleasure, which is the other thing that overwhelms men's concern, is the reward given by nature for the performance of those acts which are ordered to the perpetuation of the species. So pleasure is not an end in itself, but is simply a sideshow. It's something to induce us to perform acts which are ordered to more serious goods. So pleasure clearly can't be the ballgame, the whole thing. Obviously, wealth isn't, especially today. If it wasn't, it isn't anymore. We're about to become a nation of paupers, I'm afraid. Wealth is a means to an end anyway. It's economic power. You ever try to eat a lettuce salad? Just money? Can't eat it. You have to use the money to buy the lettuce and then eat it. So wealth is only a means. Power, again, the problem with power, if anything, is it corrupts us. The more power that we possess. And power, of course, always raises the question of, well, how are you going to use it? Power is not ethical in itself. It demands an ethics to direct it properly to proper ends. So obviously, power is not an end in itself. Friendship is a wonderful thing, but at least in this life, unfortunately, sadly, it has to come to an end. So it's not going to completely satisfy us. Progress, well, that one's just plain silly. Which is why one should never want to be called a progressive. Progress gets you nowhere unless you know where you're going. It's the old idea of change. Change for its own sake. You know, you always got to remember the French Revolution whenever you think of change. Change is not always for the better. Two kinds of change, for the better and for the worse. Progress assumes that you're somehow going towards something that's better, but then the question is, well, what's the measure of it being better? So it's not an end in itself. It's ordered to some other good that is superior to it. And of course, the biggest question, or the biggest point, is that perfect happiness is not attainable in this life because we're going to die. We're going to give it up. We're going to give up everything. And all of this leads St. Thomas to move towards the final conclusion that the true end is God alone. God alone, attained by acts of perfect knowledge and perfect love. As it says, the intellect can conceive the universal good. Nothing will satisfy us except the universal good, concretely realized in the divine being. every limited good, however good it is, we immediately recognize is not perfectly good by definition, because it's limited. There are some aspects of goodness it doesn't have. Every finite being is a finite good, no matter how good it is, no matter how wonderful it is. The only thing that, and because our mind is ordered to the universal good, the only thing that will ever ultimately satisfy us would be the attainment of the supreme good, which is God himself. Attained, notice, by virtue. Virtues are good operative habits. Here we're talking about moral virtues. We're talking about the kinds of acts that perfect the human person and render him suitable to attaining God as his last end. So, to make the long story short, what is the purpose of this life? Since we cannot attain ultimate happiness in it, the only logical reason that we are here, and remember we are created by God, it's got to make some sense. The purpose of this life has to be that of a preparation for the attainment of our last end in a life after this one. Because we're not going to get there in this life. And God would be cruel to have given us this desire, but universally have it not attainable. So you've got to put ethics into the framework of metaphysics and realize God is in the background. God has created our nature. We're not just sitting here spinning stories about our nature considered in the abstract all by itself. All by itself, it would make no sense. It would be going nowhere. We'd wind up with the despair of the existentialists. Man would be sein zum Tod, a being toward death, going nowhere but to death. And of course, that's why the existentialists are so miserable. It's the problem of the atheist, as I've mentioned before. All at his funeral, all dressed up and no place to go. But we know better. Man is created by God with a last end, which we apprehend and which we seek, which cannot be attained in this life, but must be attained in the life to come. That doesn't mean we understand what's to come after this world, but we do at least know God is infinitely good, has created us with a nature which has this innate desire, which cannot be frustrated because you know the old dictum even the ancients had, that a natural desire cannot be frustrated. But the metaphysical underpinning of it is that God is the author of nature, and his own internal integrity requires that a natural desire be capable of fulfillment. And it is, remember, we are differentiated from all other creatures by the possession of freedom. And freedom to choose those acts which are morally good, meaning they incline us towards the last end, the good last end that we should attain. The habit, the disposition, the natural inclination to perform those acts that lead us towards our last end is what we call virtue. And virtue inclines us to virtuous acts. So that's what ethics is about. We're trying to learn the science of virtuous acts, those acts which will lead us towards our last end. Okay, any questions about any of that? Because we're going to get into a slightly different topic here.
So how would you respond to challenges coming from utilitarian schools of thought, particularly to do with this identification of God being the final end and our human nature being the desire to reach that end, yet most of us fall short of it, and most of us don't reach that end or fail to discern it?
Well, I don't know. I'd want to say most of us don't reach the end. I don't know. We haven't gotten there yet. I mean, as far as I know, we're all a work in progress.
Well, you pointed out that there's
Yep.
a roadmap
Right.
to getting to God, and that being ethics. And there's many instances, and we perpetually choose the wrong things and make the wrong
Absolutely.
decisions. And we
Absolutely.
fail to use that roadmap.
We-
Where
we
the
get lost.
utilitarians or the rational choice theorists would say, their explanation, I think, is more consistent in that they presume everyone to be a utility maximizer, and that being human nature. That we all maximize, be it pleasure or happiness, however you want to identify it.
Depends on
It's consistent across the board, where everyone seeks to maximize their appetitive desires, so to say.
Well, the problem is you have to ask, what is human nature? I mean, human nature sure does move us in the direction of seeking every possible pleasure. It moves us in the direction of seeking all these things we were describing here. But the question is, does it always move us? How are we to determine which particular acts are ordered to attaining that end? Because somebody might say, well, the way that I will attain my last end is by subjugating half the world. And then I have to ask the question, well, then how am I supposed to know whether I'm supposed to do that or not? How do I know whether that's what we'd call a good thing or not? Everybody agrees it's wonderful to get to good ends. The problem with the utilitarian is, how are you going to get there? What are the means that you select to get there? Is any means licit because it gets you to the end? And that, of course, is the whole point of utilitarianism or pragmatism, that the end justifies the means. And, of course, the essence of natural law ethics is to say, whoa, that's just simply untrue. The end, the good end, does not justify an evil means. But then we have to determine what acts are evil. Are there acts that by their nature are evil? If there are, then nothing's going to make them good, just because you're trying to use them to get to a good end. So we have to find out, which we haven't done yet, we have to find out, are there some acts that are evil? Are there some acts that by their very nature are contrary to our human nature? Inappropriate for a human being. Might be appropriate for a frog, but not to a human being. So this, of course, is the big difference between the utilitarian purview and the natural law purview, that you have to look at the structure of the human being and ask whether anything that I want to do, which I think will lead me to my last end, is thereby justified. Natural law says, wait a minute, the human nature has a specific structure which is such that I can't just bend it any way I want in order to get any means to any end that I want. And that, of course, is something you have to work out as you go through it.
But the problematic thing from a theoretical standpoint is that in our model, most of our agents aren't working towards the ends that we've identified as being collective and universal.
You mean people
Whereas
do bad things?
People do bad things.
Okay.
They're not operating in an ethical
Right.
manner. Whereas for the utilitarians, everyone consistently works within that model, in that they all can be identified as utility maximizers, whether they seek power or wealth or cake.
But the difficulty is that with the utilitarian ethics, we have justified euthanasia, abortion, sterilization, adultery, and everything else that one could usually list as being sinful and objectionable. So what went wrong here? I mean, why this vast difference? Utilitarianism, unfortunately, can justify anything. Everybody may seem to be on the right road, but the problem is that the road may not be right, objectively. And that's why we have to go back and say, wait a minute, what is the nature of man? Is every act okay? And, of course, to do that, we've got to take a closer look at human nature. The problem with utilitarianism is it justifies everything. Everybody's on the right road, even if the roads conflict, even if their acts conflict. You get into an epistemological problem of trying to determine how is it that everybody seeking his last end is doing things in which many times one person's good act is contradictory to another's. So we've got to sort out, how do you determine who's right and who's wrong in that context? How do you determine whether there is an objective right or wrong, not a subjective one, because subjectively both people who are contradicting each other may think they're right, but the question is, are they both objectively right? From the utilitarian standpoint, I think you'd have to say they're both right. But from a natural law standpoint, one might say, if the end you're trying to attain entails removing my head, this is objectionable. And perhaps we can give reasons as to why it's objectionable. And that's what you have to do as you go through natural law. You have to look at human nature and determine which things are appropriate and which things are not appropriate. Because, you see, God gave us reason, and he expects us to use our reason in order to determine what acts are suitable to our nature. And that's an objective question. Subjective, because I have to figure it out. Objective, because I have to make my understanding correspond to the reality of my nature. And my nature is not subjective. It's an objective fact that I am a rational animal possessing sentient vegetative powers that operate in certain specific ways. That's what I've got to pay attention to. And we will see as we go through that, sure, pragmatism, utilitarianism, heck, the Benthamites for a period of time were very influential in 19th century English Parliament. They were passing laws based upon this seeking of the sensible good for men in this life. But the difficulty is, you'll see even today that we are getting laws being enacted by our present government which violate such things as the individual right of conscience. But to do so in the name of providing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Even if you grant that what they are doing does promote the greatest good for the greatest number, does that justify suppressing the conscience of individual people who are morally opposed to it? See, that's the sort of thing that you get into. Utilitarianism can justify everything. And that's its weakness, because not everything is good. But we have to find out what makes a thing to be morally evil. If you can find something that is morally evil, then you can't use utilitarianism to justify using it to get to a good end. So that's kind of where it cuts to the chase in terms of determining which is a valid system. Obviously, the downside of natural law is that many of us don't live up to it. And that implies, if you really do a good job of not living up to it, maybe you're not going to get to your last end. And that's a real downer. But it goes with the territory. It does appear that this life, I guess, looks like something of a test, doesn't it? And when you have a test, some people do better than others. And some people, God forbid, fail. But that doesn't mean the test is wrong. It may mean that the applicant is wrong. Anyway, we're going to the bottom of the page here, well, section 2. Your notes are never the same as mine. We're going to take up the issue of freedom and responsibility. We can go another few minutes here. You see the etymology here. I don't know how to handle this one, because I got the etymology by copying Dr. Waters' notes. And he's not here to defend himself, and I love him dearly. But the Latin, I don't think, is what he had. It says re, which is back, and pons, which means await. Well, pons is a await. That's correct. But the word is from re and spondere. And spondere means to answer. So the real meaning of responsibility is to answer back. You are answerable for your actions. And I'm sure he's very happy that I just taught you the correct information. Imputability. Responsibility, this is what's at issue. Imputability means you're the guy that did it. I'm the person responsible for the action. That's what we say this action is imputable to this person. Who killed James? Well, Fred did. It's his responsibility. But it applies only when something's under our control. If something's not under our control, then we say, I'm not responsible. And you know, how do I excuse myself when I do something terrible? First thing I say is, I didn't do it. Well, if I don't get away with that one, the next thing I say is, well, I couldn't help myself. It's not my responsibility. There's nothing I could do about it. So we have to examine closely how to determine when one is responsible or not responsible. And I'm looking at my notes here. I think I didn't turn the wrong page. I'm trying to figure out how the next line in the notes at all responds to what I just gave you. But I'm going to follow the notes because I don't want to miss anything, especially if I haven't read it before. Well, okay, I think the relevance here is that to be responsible, we have to be free. And this is just opening up the notion of rationality implying freedom, which I guess we had not really talked about that so much before. How do we know that we're free? We're rational beings, have an intellect. How does it tell us that we are free? It flows from the spirituality of the intellect, which is demonstrated in philosophical psychology. But the key to our freedom is the fact that we choose between finite goods. It arises because of the limitation of the object. I've actually given this to you before. I hope I'm not repeating myself, but for purposes of this course, we have to repeat it, don't we? This is the example that I gave you about the box of chocolates. Some of you recall I forget, the Whitman's chocolates, remember? That you open them up and they've got the little map on them, the little floor plan that tells you where every chocolate is. And if somebody gives you the box of chocolates and says, here, take one, you think that's wonderful until you open it up and you look at the map and you say, oh, well, which one? They're all different, and I like them all. If I choose one, I suddenly realize this person who said take one is a sadist because he's allowing me to choose but one. I may like a cherry cordial. I may also like a caramel. But if I choose the cherry cordial, I can't have the caramel. And if I choose the caramel, I can't have the cherry cordial. Why? Because they're good. They're wonderful goods. I really enjoy them, but by golly, they're finite goods. The cherry cordial is wonderful as a cherry cordial, but sad to say, it doesn't have the flavor of a caramel. And the caramel is wonderfully caramel, but it's not a cherry cordial. So that in choosing the one good, I deny myself the other good. Now this sadist might let up a little bit and say, well, you can have a couple of them. At which point I say, all right, I'm going to have, now wait a minute, which do I want first? If I take the cherry cordial, that's going to change the flavor of the caramel. If I take the caramel, that's going to change the flavor of the cherry cordial. There's only one solution. I'll put them both in my mouth at once. But then, of course, I've created a third flavor, haven't I? Now, all of this arises from the fact that I'm dealing with finite goods. And it's precisely because they are finite, it's because the caramel is not the cherry cordial, that I can refuse the caramel because I want the cherry cordial. I can refuse the cherry cordial because I want the caramel. Life is filled with cherry cordials and caramels. Life is filled with choices between finite goods. And every finite good is composed of two elements. The good part I want the flavor of the caramel, and the bad part I don't want, namely the loss of the flavor of the cherry. So in choosing every finite good, I deny myself some alternative finite good. And that's why ultimately the only thing that's going to satisfy me is the infinite good. Well, it's consuming the whole box at once. All the negations and limitations removed. It's a metaphysical problem. But in this life, because we understand the universal good, we are not absolutely coerced by any particular good. That is the ontological structure, which is the foundation for human freedom. And that's why rationality is tied to freedom. You got an intellect, you got a will. You got an intellect, you got an intellective appetite. The intellective appetite is the will. So automatically, intellective beings are free beings. The only thing that would not be a free act would be if you are already in apprehension of, if you've already attained the infinite good. Because then there's no limited good which would tempt you away from it. It's a completely voluntary act, but freedom is now gone because freedom serves no purpose. But we're not in that state. We're in this finite world dealing with finite goods, and therefore we are free to choose between them. And that is the basis for the freedom which enables us to choose between finite goods that will make us responsible for the acts that we choose if they are in the moral order. And if these acts, good or bad, are imputable to us because we are the ones responsible by our free, deliberate action for choosing them. So here you've got part of the mechanism, the central part of the mechanism, which we will be exploring in subsequent classes, but we've run out of time this evening. Thank you.